Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It's the 21st of June, and a lot of updates this week because they've caught up. Microsoft have actually changed the system, I think temporarily, for how they make the updates available. There's no RSS feed at the moment. They're publishing a weekly article. So they're going to post that on Thursdays. So, hey, for the next, few months, it's going to be a little bit of a different process, but they've caught up and now we'll see them weekly. So that means I have a very busy Thursday night to get it ready for Friday morning. As always, I do have the chapters, so you can jump to the particular update you care about the most. And new videos this week. So I was able to post a video that I created the week before on the multi-cloud connector. So today, that's about connecting to AWS just via the APIs. I don't have to deploy any agents. And it brings the AWS resources as Azure Resource Manager. So the Azure control plane resources, which helps with inventory, a single place I can go to start to see the resources I have. And also they have a solution now to onboard to Azure Arc, the supported resources. Today that's VMs. I think that will expand in the future. So it then makes it really easy to then go the additional step to bring more detail about the resources into Azure, and also then start to use the Azure capabilities for those VMs that are running in AWS. And then I did a video on Copilot for security. I thought it was about time I did this. So I dive into what it is, how it's working, the signals that it's hooking into, and then I demo a whole bunch of the different integrations it has, so the embedded experience. And then I show you the standalone experience. So I really go through the detail about that. Okay, so on to what's new. App Insights OpenTelemetry based distro now has live metrics in GA. So the OpenTelemetry is that open source solution. And then when we talk about a distro, that's some customized distribution of it. In this case, Azure has customized it to hook into the Azure-based services. And what this lets me do is, with a single line of code, hook into my applications. And so the live metrics gives me around a 1 second latency to see metrics related to my application. So that might be super useful when I'm trying to look at maybe failure rates. Maybe I'm trying to look at performance. And that's going to be supported on ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core, Azure Functions, Java, Node.js, and I think Python as well. So that is now GA. For your use of App Insights. VMSS Flexible Orchestration Mode upgrade policies are available in preview. Remember, the whole point of VMSS Flexible Orchestration compared to Uniform, with Flexible, I can have a mix of SKUs, I can have a mix of spot and non-spot, but I can still have a VM profile where I want to stamp out copies based on some template. Well, the upgrade policy relates to how do we bring those instances up to date when we have a new version. So there's automatic. Automatic is there's no guarantee of anything. It could do them all at the same time. That might be okay for dev test. Then there's manual, which is where I need the absolute most control, where it is not going to touch it. You have to go and trigger it. And then we have rolling upgrade. Rolling upgrade is probably going to be the most common we'll see. And that's where it follows your maintenance windows. It follows those core principles of availability. So AZ by AZ is looking at the success rates. And I can use max surge to add additional instances, new instances, so I don't even see a drop in capacity, the scale of what that can do, while it's taking a couple out at a time and upgrading it. So now that policy is in preview. The AKS AZ command invoke is GA. So this lets me run a command inside my AKS cluster from the AZ command line. So I could think about, hey, AZ command invoke, and then kubectl get nodes. So it's just a way through the Azure CLI to directly hook into and interact with my AKS cluster. The AKS Linux node now has a security patch channel. So this is focused around the Node OS upgrade feature. So it's for my Linux-based node pools. And what this now lets me do is there's different ways we can think about patching the nodes inside the node pool. Now I can have unmanaged, and unmanaged will just use the native feature of the operating system and whatever patching that does and whatever timing that does. So I have no control. But what this new security patch channel does is this will only install the patches labeled as security by the various maintainers of the image, and the AKS team will validate those. So it's only going to be the security updates. They're validated by the AKS team. And once again, that's going to adhere to the normal maintenance windows, best practices using AZs, etc., etc. AKS cluster operation status is in preview. It just lets me get a snapshot of the progress of long-running operations on my AKS cluster. I could think about an upgrade, scale actions, creation actions, and more. The Azure Kubernetes Kube Egress Gateway. So this is available. This is an open source project. It works for AKS, but also unmanaged Kubernetes clusters running in Azure, i.e., hey, I've just got Kubernetes I've deployed inside a virtual machine or something else. And this would replace using something like NAT Gateway. So it runs as a workload in the containers inside the cluster itself, and it's going to be leveraged for that pod traffic, so the pod's running in the nodes, egressing out. So through this solution, I'll assign a set of IP addresses. It will actually leverage WireGuard tunnels, which is kind of a simplified VPN, to establish the connectivity. And I say, hey, these pods are going to use this egress IP, these pods use that egress IP. So it gives me control, but it does operate at a pretty big scale. And it's a very simple solution to leverage. Oh, didn't mean to say that. And then Azure Container Apps are now available in the Virginia region of the Azure Gov Cloud. Remember, the Azure Container Apps provides that abstracted AKS environment, but it adds on key things I would use for microservices. So think Dapper, CADA, Envoy for the networking, just gets all that in place so I can just focus on my microservice, get it deployed, and my other container-based apps. So now in Gov region, I can take advantage of that. On the networking side, so the Azure Virtual Network Manager, mesh and direct connectivity options are now generally available. Remember, Azure Virtual Network Manager provides a centralized set of services for my virtual networks. One of them are the security admin rules, which run in front of network security groups to control flows of traffic. There are other things they're doing around user-defined routes, but this is about the connectivity between the virtual networks. So mesh makes sense. Everything is connected to everything. Direct connectivity is where I'm using a hub and spoke, but I want the spokes to still be able to talk to each other without having to hop via the hub. And so this actually uses a construct called a connected group, which doesn't even require me to peer the VNets. It does something on the back end of the networking itself. So now that option is generally available. On the storage side, so force detach for my zone redundant data disk is in preview. So consider the scenario. I have a ZRS data disk, and that has its copies of data, the 3 copies distributed over the 3 availability zones that are available in that region for my subscription. So it's highly durable. An entire facility or multiple facilities could fail, and my data is still there. So I get this massive number of 9s for the durability. But if a zone had a failure and the VM that was attached to this disk was in that failed zone, the disk gets in a stuck state. With this, I can force the detach that would then let me reattach it to a different virtual machine in a still healthy zone. And that's going to work for both the premium and standard SSD disks. On the database side, there's a lot. So Azure SQL Database now has enhanced text and Unicode operators. This is in preview. So for the Unicode, what they've added in is this unistr function. And what it will let me do is pass in a collection of text and also Unicode values. You do the slash and then the Unicode value, and it will output that UTF-8 or UTF-16 encoded string that I can then use in whatever kinds of structures I have in my database. So it makes it much easier to work with Unicode characters. But then also, just for my ANSI SQL, it has a concatenate for the string. So it's 2 bars, and I just pass in the different strings I want to concatenate, and it's going to spit out that combination all within one expression. Azure SQL Managed Instance Advanced Notifications has gone GA. So this gives me 24 hours notice before a planned maintenance event. This works with your SQL maintenance windows. So it gives me great control of when it happens and that advanced notification. That notification ties into service health alerts. It's going to tell me the affected region, the affected service, the list of impacted resources, and the status of the maintenance event. Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, I can now, for the named replicas, so a read replica, I can now use zone redundancy. So I get that increased resiliency for that read replica, wherever that may be. And for Cosmos DB, if I'm leveraging the Azure Synapse link, remember the Azure Synapse link is all about taking that operational data I have, so that transactional store, and replicating it to an analytical store. Well, what I can now do is enable, even when I have that turned on, continuous backup. And I can keep that for 7 or 30 days, depending on the tier I pick. And what's really nice about the continuous backup is it's not consuming extra RUs, it's not impacting performance. It's just writing to a storage account in that region into blobs. Cosmos DB for MongoDB. The V core now has V7 support in GA. And Azure Service Bus Premium now has geo-replication in preview. So this is the metadata and the data of the namespace is continuously replicated from the primary to the secondary. It allows me to promote the secondary to the primary at any time. And there's a single host name we use to connect to whichever is that primary at any given moment in time. PostgreSQL Flexible now has IOPS scaling in GA. So I can dynamically change the IOPS associated with the disks that the PostgreSQL Flexible is using. It's using the performance tier feature of SSD disks. And so what it's letting me do is when I need extra IOPS, I can bump up the performance tier. I'm going to pay for that. Then when I don't need it, I can bump it back down. Remember, when I bump it back down, I can only do that once every 12 hours. So there's just a few limitations on leveraging that. But it lets me now add and remove IOPS based on when I may have need for additional performance. PostgreSQL Flexible now has hooks into Azure Advisor. So there's new recommendations. This is checking for long-running orphaned transactions, crossing the transaction wraparound limit, and exceeding the recommended bloat ratio. PostgreSQL Flexible Extension version sync is in preview. So this just lets me now, with a single command, I can do an alter extension, the name of the extension update, and it will go and bring that extension up to the latest version to make sure I'm running the latest, greatest, and most secure. PostgreSQL Flexible Online Migration Service is in preview. Now, there's both an offline and an online option for this, but what they've now got is for the online, when I'm migrating to Azure PostgreSQL Flexible, I can migrate from both the Azure Postgres single server, I can migrate from the AWS RDS for PostgreSQL, and I can migrate from a PostgreSQL instance running in an OS. That could be a VM in Azure, that could be running on premises with almost zero downtime. Now, if the requirements for the online don't meet your needs, maybe I don't have a primary key in all my tables, then I could use the offline instead. And Azure Monitor log alerts now support Azure Data Explorer. So Azure Monitor log alert rules let me run some query against my log analytics workspace. This could be my regular Azure Monitor, it could be App Insights. And then based on those results, I can trigger an alert. Well, now it also works against Azure Data Explorer. And I can even join tables from Azure Data Explorer with my log analytics workspace. So that's a pretty cool, nice feature. And for the Oracle database at Azure, remember that's where we have these Oracle clusters in the Azure data centers. So I get so low latency between those databases running on the Oracle physical infrastructure in the Azure data center and my other Azure services. Well, now the autonomous database offering is also now available in GA. Miscellaneous. So log analytics dedicated clusters are now supported in the portal. We used to have to use CLI or PowerShell or REST. Well, now we can just manage that within the portal. I can create them, I can delete them, I can link and unlink workspaces, change the commitment tier, view the configuration all nicely from the portal. And they have said the next thing they want to add is the ability for customer managed key to be used in the portal as well. Log Analytics summary rules are available in preview. So consider I've got this constant stream of data coming into my workspace. What the summary rules let me do is, as it's being ingested, it can run a query that I specify that will then spit out a summary of some time duration I set. That can be from every 20 minutes up to 24 hours, and there's certain supported increments in between there. Now, it doesn't work against historical data. It's doing it at ingestion time. But the great thing is that then summarization is these much smaller chunks that are going into some other table, which could even be a basic table, which remember is cheaper if I want to just store it for longer, but at a lower cost. And then it obviously hooks into the archival as well. But also it might be useful if I have certain sensitive data that I don't want to maintain. Well, that would be removed as part of the KQL query I write for the summarization. And I'll just get that data without that other information that I might want people to have access to. So those summary rules are now available in preview. Azure Monitor log enablement policy expansion is in GA. So the whole point of this is I can think that, hey, I as an organization want to make sure I have diagnostic settings turned on for all the different logs, for all the supported resources to go to Azure Storage or Event Hub to go to some then external SIM or Log Analytics workspace. So now we have policies to deploy if not exist, so to remediate and enforce this at time of creation. And they also created a bunch of initiatives, just quickly show it, that help you track if it's been done or not. So what I'm looking for are these kind of all logs. So there's one here to make sure they're all going to storage. There's one here to make sure they're going to Event Hub. And there should be one, there it is. And then there's also one to make sure it's going to Log Analytics. And then if you go and look at it, it's basically checking for all of the different types of resources that are supported. So this is a way as an organization, I can both require that diagnostic setting to be configured, so I have that ability, then also I can go and run a compliance check via that built-in initiative. Azure Functions are now integrated with Azure Load Testing from the portal. So I can create and run a load test directly within the Azure Function experience in the portal. I just specify the function I want, the parameters, the load configuration, and then I'll be able to see both the client side and the function metrics to help identify performance bottlenecks and other problems. Azure Load Testing now has a debug mode in GA. So this would be where, hey, I need some additional data based on that testing it's doing. Now, this can't run at the same scale as a normal Azure load test. In fact, no matter what I configure, it will only run on a single test engine. And no matter what I configure, it will only run for up to 10 minutes. But it will now give me the debug logs, including the complete request response for any failed requests. So this would help me with my troubleshooting. Entra ID have announced a licensing change for your multi-tenant organizations. And I'll link it in the description. But really the summary of this is that it's one user, one license. That's the whole big deal. So for your P1, P2, and your Entra governance licenses, if you're one of those organizations that has multiple tenants, maybe that's for some regulatory reason, maybe that's because of acquisition, I don't now have to worry about buying the same human being, the same entity, multiple licenses for each of the tenants. Hey, I'm a particular physical entity in the real world, one license, P1, P2, the governance will cover me no matter how many tenants my organization actually has. And finally, Azure Landing Zones have announced support for availability zones and multiple regions. So I can think about adding additional resiliency to the deployments that it's doing to use those AZs in the region. And I can configure DR regions. I can configure the networking configuration for that DR region, all within the Azure Landing Zone experience. So that was it. A pretty big update because I think they're catching up on a bunch of stuff. As always, I hope that was useful. Until next video, take care.